December 19, 1944. The air tasted of pine resin and cordite, cold enough to sting the lungs with every breath. Beneath the skeletal canopy of frost-laden trees, a young American soldier crouched in a foxhole barely wide enough for his shoulders, his fingers numb around the stock of his M1 Garand. His name was Private First Class Joseph Beyrle, 20 years old, from Muskegon, Michigan. He had jumped into Normandy on D-Day with the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, survived 33 days of brutal hedgerow fighting, and now found himself surrounded by the forward elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division during what history would remember as the Battle of the Bulge. The forest smelled of burned rubber and wet earth. Somewhere in the distance, a German MG-42 chattered its mechanical song, firing in short, disciplined bursts that echoed through the hollows like the tearing of fabric. Beyrle was laughing. Not the hollow laughter of a man losing his grip on sanity, but the quiet, almost private chuckle of someone who had just realized something profoundly absurd. Around him lay the frozen bodies of 3 German soldiers he had killed moments earlier with his bayonet when his rifle jammed. His uniform was torn. His face was blackened with dirt and dried blood, not all of it his own. And yet he laughed, because in that moment, staring at the approaching line of Waffen-SS troops moving through the trees with their STG-44 assault rifles and camouflaged winter smocks, he understood with perfect clarity that he was about to die. And there was something darkly funny about that certainty, something liberating. But Joseph Beyrle did not die that morning. What happened instead would become one of the most extraordinary and least known episodes of the Second World War, a story that begins with capture, continues through escape, imprisonment and betrayal, and culminates in a 50-second eruption of violence so concentrated, so efficient, that it would leave 25 enemy soldiers dead and fundamentally alter the trajectory of one man's war. To understand how a single American paratrooper came to kill 25 German soldiers in less than a minute, one must first understand what it meant to be captured by the Wehrmacht in the winter of 1944, when Germany's military machine was collapsing, but its ideological convictions had hardened into something brittle and desperate. By December of that year, the Third Reich was dying. The Red Army had driven German forces out of the Soviet Union and was approaching the borders of the Reich itself. The Western Allies had liberated France and were preparing to cross the Rhine. Adolf Hitler, increasingly detached from reality, had gambled everything on one final offensive through the Ardennes, a desperate bid to split the Allied armies, recapture the port of Antwerp, and force the Western powers to negotiate a separate peace. It was a strategy born of fantasy, fueled by methamphetamine and delusion, and it would consume the last reserves of Germany's military strength in a matter of weeks. The soldiers who captured Joseph Beyrle were part of this dying machine. They were young, many of them teenagers conscripted in the final months of the war, but they were also indoctrinated, trained to view their enemy not merely as adversaries, but as representatives of a corrupting, degenerate civilization. American soldiers, in particular, were portrayed in Nazi propaganda as mongrelized products of Jewish capitalism, soft, undisciplined, motivated only by material comfort. The Waffen-SS, the military arm of Heinrich Himmler's Schutzstaffel, prided itself on ideological purity and martial superiority. To be captured by them was to enter a system that did not recognize the Geneva Conventions as anything more than a suggestion. Beyrle was searched, stripped of his dog tags, his watch, his cigarettes, and marched at gunpoint through the frozen forest to a temporary holding area where other captured American paratroopers sat in the snow, hands behind their heads, breath steaming in the frigid air. He expected to be interrogated, perhaps beaten. He did not expect what came next. The SS officer in charge, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and the silver oak leaves of a Hauptsturmführer on his collar, ordered the prisoners to stand. He spoke English with a Bavarian accent, each word clipped and precise. He informed them that they were saboteurs and terrorists, not soldiers, and that under the laws of war they could be executed immediately. Then he smiled, a cold, bureaucratic smile, and said they would be given a chance to prove their value to the Reich. Those who cooperated would be treated as prisoners of war. Those who resisted would be shot. Beyrle did not cooperate. He was transported by truck to Stalag XIIA, a sprawling prisoner-of-war camp near Limburg, Germany, where over 20,000 Allied soldiers were held in conditions that violated every standard of humane treatment. The barracks were unheated. Rations consisted of watery soup made from potato peels and ersatz bread baked with sawdust. Dysentery and typhus swept through the camp in waves. Men died daily, their bodies stacked like firewood near the latrines, until they could be carted away for burial in unmarked graves. The guards, many of them older men unfit for frontline service, were cruel in the casual, bureaucratic way of people who had stopped seeing prisoners as human beings. But Joseph Beyrle was not interested in surviving as a prisoner. He was interested in escaping. On January 9, 1945, 21 days after his capture, Beyrle and 2 other American paratroopers cut through the perimeter wire during a nighttime air raid and disappeared into the German countryside. They moved east, avoiding roads, stealing food from farms, sleeping in barns and abandoned buildings. They were recaptured 3 days later by a Wehrmacht patrol near the town of Waldkapelle and returned to Stalag XIIA, where they were beaten with rifle butts and locked in isolation cells for 2 weeks. Beyrle escaped again on February 2. This time he made it 60 kilometers before being captured by a Gestapo unit and transported to a military prison in Berlin. He was interrogated for 3 days, hung by his wrists from a ceiling beam, and threatened with execution as a spy. When he refused to provide intelligence, he was sent to another camp, and then another. He lost track of the prisons. The camps blurred together into a single gray continuum of hunger, cold, and violence. And then, on a frozen morning in late February 1945, somewhere in eastern Germany near the advancing Soviet front, Joseph Beyrle escaped for the 3rd and final time. He was being transported by rail with a group of other prisoners when Allied aircraft strafed the train. In the chaos, Beyrle broke away and ran into the surrounding forest. He moved east, toward the sound of artillery fire. Because he knew the Red Army was coming and he believed, rightly, as it turned out, that the Soviets would be too disorganized and too desperate for manpower to ask many questions about a lone American paratrooper stumbling out of the woods. What Joseph Beyrle could not have anticipated was how his war was about to change. The Soviet tankers who found him on the outskirts of a village called Landsberg and Der Warth did not immediately believe he was an American soldier. His uniform was in tatters. He spoke no Russian. He looked like a scarecrow, gaunt and hollow-eyed, weighing perhaps 130 pounds. But he had his dog tags, hidden in the lining of his boot throughout his captivity. And he had a story that, however improbable, was corroborated by the wounds on his wrists and the desperation in his eyes. The Soviet lieutenant in charge, a woman named Alexandra Samyuzenko, commander of a T-34 tank battalion, made a decision that would have been unthinkable in any other army. She allowed Beyrle to join her unit. For the next 6 weeks, Private First Class Joseph Beyrle of the United States Army fought as a tanker in the 1st Guards Tank Army of the Red Army, participating in the Soviet drive toward Berlin. He learned to load a 76 gun, to recognize the silhouette of a Panther tank at 800 meters, to sleep sitting up inside a steel coffin that smelled of diesel fuel and burned flesh. He fought at Kustrin and Silo Heights. He watched Soviet soldiers die in numbers that made the Ardennes look like a skirmish. And he came to understand, in a way few American soldiers ever did, what the Eastern Front actually meant, the scale of it, the brutality, the totalizing erasure of all distinctions between combatant and civilian, between war and annihilation. But it was not in the rubble of Berlin or the smoking fields of Brandenburg that Joseph Beyrle killed 25 German soldiers in 50 seconds. It was in a small village called Neukirch, 30 kilometers west of the Oder River, on March 14, 1945. The village had been bypassed by the main Soviet advance and was still held by a rear guard unit of the Wehrmacht. Approximately 80 soldiers dug into defensive positions around the town center, supported by 2 Pak-40 anti-tank guns and a handful of Panzerfausts. The Soviet plan was straightforward. A company of infantry would assault from the north, while Semyuzenko's tank platoon provided fire support from the east. Beyrle was assigned to the lead tank, a T-34-85, as assistant gunner. The assault began at dawn with a barrage of Katyusha rockets that turned the village square into a moonscape of craters and burning timber. The tanks rolled forward, their tracks clanking over frozen earth, firing high-explosive rounds into the German positions. The infantry followed, crouched low, moving from cover to cover with the jerky efficiency of veteran troops. And then the lead tank, Beyrle's tank, was hit. The Pak-40 round struck the turret at an oblique angle, punching through the armor and detonating inside the crew compartment. The driver and gunner were killed instantly. Lieutenant Semyuzenko, standing in the commander's hatch, was blown clear by the force of the explosion, landing unconscious in the mud 20 feet away. Joseph Beyrle, seated in the loader's position, was thrown against the side of the turret, his left arm broken, his face lacerated by shrapnel. He should have stayed down. He should have crawled out of the burning tank and waited for the infantry to secure the position. Instead, he laughed. It was the same laugh from the Ardennes, the dark, private acknowledgement of absurdity. He had survived D-Day, 33 days in Normandy, capture by the SS, 3 escapes, interrogation by the Gestapo, and 6 weeks fighting with the Red Army, only to be blown up in a Soviet tank in a village whose name he could not even pronounce. It was so ridiculous, so cosmically unfair, that it circled back around to being funny. Beyrle pulled himself out of the turret, his broken arm dangling uselessly at his side, and dropped to the ground beside the burning T-34. His ears rang. His vision swam. Smoke billowed from the open hatch, thick and black, smelling of burning rubber and cooked meat. Around him, the battle continued. Soviet infantry pinned down behind a stone wall, German soldiers firing from the windows of half-collapsed buildings, the staccato bark of machine guns and the deeper thump of grenades. And there, 15 meters away, Beyrle saw it. A German ammunition bunker, partially concealed behind a pile of rubble, its entrance unguarded. What happened next lasted 50 seconds. Beyrle ran. He ran with his left arm flapping against his side, his right hand fumbling for the PPSH-41 submachine gun slung across his chest, a weapon he had taken from a dead Soviet soldier weeks earlier. The Germans saw him coming. 3 soldiers emerged from the bunker entrance, rifles raised, shouting in voices Beyrle could barely hear through the ringing in his ears. He fired from the hip, holding the trigger down, sweeping the weapon in a horizontal arc. The PPSH-41 had a 71-round drum magazine, and a cyclic rate of 900 rounds per minute. In 3 seconds, Beyrle emptied half the drum into the 3 Germans at point-blank range, their bodies jerking and collapsing in a tangle of limbs. He reloaded without stopping, ejecting the spent drum and slamming in a fresh one with his one functioning hand, and plunged through the bunker entrance. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the chemical smell of explosives. Wooden crates were stacked floor to ceiling, ammunition, grenades, Panzerfaust warheads. And there, at the far end of the bunker, illuminated by a single kerosene lantern, were 22 German soldiers taking cover from the Soviet barrage. They turned as Beyrle entered. For a single frozen instant, both sides stared at each other. An American paratrooper in a Soviet uniform, caked in blood and mud, standing in the entrance with a Russian submachine gun, and 24 Wehrmacht soldiers armed with Karabiner 98K rifles they had stacked against the wall because they thought they were safe. Joseph Beyrle fired first. He held the trigger down and swept the weapon left to right, the muzzle flash strobing in the confined space, the sound deafening, the 7.62 rounds ricocheting off the stone walls and punching through wooden crates and human flesh with equal indifference. He emptied the entire magazine, 71 rounds, in less than 7 seconds. The Germans did not have time to reach their rifles. They did not have time to scream. They simply fell, toppling over each other in the narrow space, their blood spraying across the crates of ammunition and pooling on the dirt floor. Beyrle dropped the empty submachine gun and grabbed one of the Panzerfausts from the nearest crate. He had never used one before. But the design was intuitive, a simple recoilless launcher with a shaped charge warhead. He flipped up the rear sight, aimed at the PaK-40 position visible through the bunker entrance and fired. The backblast filled the bunker with smoke and heat. The warhead streaked across the village square and struck the anti-tank gun head-on, detonating with a flash of white light that sent the gun's crew tumbling through the air like rag dolls. Then Beyrle collapsed. He woke up 3 hours later in a Soviet field hospital, his arm in a splint, his face bandaged, unable to hear out of his left ear. A Red Army political officer stood over him, speaking in Russian, which a translator rendered into clumsy English. "You are either the bravest man in the Soviet Union or the craziest American who ever lived." Beyrle just laughed. The official Soviet after-action report, filed on March 15, 1945, records that the assault on Newkirch resulted in 82 enemy casualties, the destruction of 2 anti-tank guns, and the capture of a strategic ammunition depot. It makes no mention of Joseph Beyrle. The American military, which had listed him as missing in action since December 1944, did not learn of his survival until April 21, 1945, when Soviet forces reached the Oder River and Beyrle was transferred to American custody. He was debriefed by Army intelligence, awarded the Purple Heart, and sent home to Michigan, where he arrived in May 1945 to find that his parents had already held a funeral service for him. For the rest of his life, Joseph Beyrle rarely spoke about the 50 seconds in the bunker at Newkirch. When pressed, he would describe it in clinical terms: the layout of the room, the number of rounds fired, the physics of confined space ballistics. He did not speak about fear or rage or adrenaline. He did not claim to be a hero. He said repeatedly that he had simply done what needed to be done, and that the real heroes were the men who died in the bunkers and foxholes and burning tanks, the ones who never came home. But there is something in that story, in the image of a single soldier, broken and half-deaf, charging into an enemy bunker with a foreign weapon and emerging victorious. that transcends the mechanics of combat and touches something deeper about the nature of resilience and the human capacity for defiance in the face of annihilation. The German soldiers in that bunker believed they were safe. They believed that the war, however badly it was going, still operated according to certain rules, that bunkers provided shelter, that superior numbers guaranteed survival, that the enemy would behave predictably. They had been told for years that American soldiers were soft, that they lacked the ideological commitment and martial discipline of the Wehrmacht, that they would fold under pressure. Joseph Beyrle proved them wrong in the most final way possible. But the deeper truth is not about German misconceptions or American toughness. It is about the difference between fighting for an ideology that demands obedience and fighting for a principle that demands only survival. The German soldiers in that bunker were there because they had been ordered to be there, because the state required their presence, because disobedience meant execution. Joseph Beyrle was there because he had chosen, again and again, to keep fighting. Not for glory, not for vengeance, but because the alternative was surrender, and surrender meant accepting a reality he refused to accept. There is a photograph of Joseph Beyrle taken in Berlin in May 1945, just before his repatriation to the United States. He is standing in front of the Brandenburg Gate, which at that time was a fire-blackened ruin surrounded by mountains of rubble. He is wearing a Soviet tanker's uniform with an American flag sewn onto the shoulder. His face is gaunt, his eyes shadowed, but he is smiling. Not the grim smile of a survivor, but something lighter, almost mischievous. The smile of a man who has seen the worst the world can offer and decided it was not enough to break him. In the decades that followed, historians would debate the significance of individual acts of valor in a war that killed over 70 million people. They would argue about whether heroism is a product of circumstance or character, whether courage can be taught or is simply a genetic accident. They would analyze the tactics and strategies that won or lost battles, the economic forces that shaped outcomes, the political decisions that determined the course of history. But none of that changes the fact that on March 14, 1945, in a bunker beneath a burning village on the German-Polish border, one man with a broken arm and a borrowed gun killed 25 enemy soldiers in 50 seconds, and in doing so wrote a footnote to the war that says something true about the difference between submission and defiance, between following orders and choosing to fight. Joseph Beyrle died in 2004 at the age of 81. He was buried with full military honors in Arlington National Cemetery. On his gravestone, beneath his name and dates of service, is a simple inscription: the only American soldier to serve in both the U.S. and Soviet armies in World War II. It does not mention the bunker. It does not mention the 50 seconds. It does not need to. Because the truth of that moment is not in the body count or the tactical outcome. It is in the laughter, the dark, private laugh of a man who understood that the world was trying to kill him and decided, against all reason, to laugh in its face and keep fighting. That is the real victory. Not the 25 dead Germans, not the captured ammunition depot, not even the survival. The victory is the laughter. The refusal to let the machinery of death have the final word. The choice, made again and again in the frozen forests and burning tanks and muddy bunkers of a dying empire, to remain human in a world designed to strip away humanity. That is what Joseph Beyrle carried out of that bunker on March 14, 1945. And that is what he carried for the rest of his life, not as a burden, but as a gift. The knowledge that no matter how dark the moment, no matter how certain the defeat, there is always one choice left: to laugh, to fight, and to refuse the silence. Do like, comment, and subscribe this channel for more hidden stories of World War II.